Hi, and welcome to the GAI Discussion Series. I'm Josh Wright, Executive Director of the Global Antitrust Institute at Scalia Law School at George Mason. And I am here today with Matt Stoller, Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project. And Matt, it is wonderful to have you here. I'm glad that we got a chance to do this. We've got lots of social media exchanges and we've met a couple of times, but we get a chance to talk. And I think I'll enjoy it, and I think our audiences will too. So thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. And by the way, thanks for reading my book. I really appreciate that. That's
to prove you've got your copy behind you. I've got my copy right here. People who know me, and I'm a big coffee drinker. There's coffee spilled on the. It's red. It's red. I can prove I actually read the thing, and I think we'll get a chance to talk about that too. The book. For what it's worth, I'm sure our audience is, folks with all sorts of different views on competition-related topics. And so I will say, you've got a lot of people who agree with you that I'm sure have read the book, and as somebody who sort of sees things a little bit differently, I highly recommend to the folks in the audience who, sort of come to the table with priors a little bit more like mine, that they read the book. I think, privately, I've told you, I think it's really well written. I enjoyed reading it. There are parts I had to put it down and walk away and come back and sort of re-engage. And some parts, I needed to call time out and come back, and some parts I disagree with, but certainly some parts where I think caused me to think about things a little bit differently and certainly understand them a little differently. So I do recommend the book.
I imagine for you, it was sort of a fun hate read.
It was a fun hate read. I think that's fair. And there were things in there.
My goal was to make it fun, like as you hated it.
Yeah, well, success. And I think there were some surprises in there for me as well. And maybe we'll get a chance to talk about some of those as well. So we can save the stuff where maybe we agree to the end. I think let's start off by, giving the people what they want a little bit and identifying the big stuff where we disagree.
We can start with like 5 minutes of just personal invective.
Well,
we could just do that.
That's what Twitter's for. So
fair point. Fair. Sorry.
We can see if we need filler time towards the end. We can always do dramatic reading. So I thought where we would start, and it's sort of big and broad, and we can go wherever you want to go here, is sort of the future of antitrust. There are, the people who are watching this, and the reason antitrust has become as interesting and popular as it's become, I think it's on a lot of people's minds in a lot of different ways. There's the economics, there's the politics, there's the policy, sort of all of that. Political winds within each side kind of blowing into each other in ways that are relatively new, or even if they're not new, more intense, or certainly it feels that way. Infighting certainly on the conservative side that I think is more intense than it's been in a while, and sort of taking different angles. And you've got across branches of government, I think some tensions that have picked up between courts and Congress, and the agencies aren't a branch, but let's throw them in there too, and the executive being a little bit more involved. And heck, on top of all of that, I hear we have an election coming up. So lots of things, and I think it's hard to kind of predict the equilibrium of where we end up. But I thought it would be a fun place to start, because it would sort of air some of how we see the world and the differences, and we can kind of jump in and discuss from there. So why don't you start with where do you see antitrust in a year and 5 years when it starts to grow up a little bit?
So I'll start with a Bork quote where he said that antitrust is a subset of ideology in the antitrust paradox, where he was, what he was saying is that the way that we think about corporate structure, corporate power, it is a part and an important part of a broader social vision. And right now we're at, I think, one of those kind of pivot points in American history that happen, every 40, 50 years or so, where we rethink prior assumptions. And it's a host of sort of social contradictions kind of start hitting against each other. And I think over the last, it probably started kind of coming off the financial crisis. So just to give you a sense of where I come at antitrust. I'm not an antitrust lawyer, but I've come at this from somebody who's been interested in corporate power for a long time. But I really got my start thinking about this during net neutrality and then the financial crisis. And at the time when I was working in Congress for a member on the Financial Services Committee, and I had always thought of banks and corporations as these kind of neutral institutions, democratic institutions. Leave them to experts, kind of who knows more about banks than bankers and economists and whatnot. And then all of a sudden, there was this crisis that seemed technical, but then it became very clear in 2010, 2009 and 10 that it was actually a political crisis. That banks and corporations were political institutions, that they were chartered, they were regulated, they operated in markets that were constituted with law. This probably seems pretty basic, but it's something that I didn't know. I hadn't sort of realized because I hadn't thought about banks and corporations as political institutions before. And I think out of this came a whole series of shocks to the way that liberals conceived of themselves, and I suspect conservatives too. I mean, you mentioned infighting on the conservative side. There's plenty of infighting on the Democratic and liberal side of the world too. And that's where it comes from. It comes from this kind of collapse of, I'd say probably the Reagan model of constituting an economy, where you just leave corporations and banks out of politics, right? And you leave it into the sphere of experts. So out of that, you saw, a whole bunch of things happen during the Obama administration, the rise of big tech, M&A consolidation. And then when Trump won, I think this really served as a shock to Democrats and Republicans, because Trump beat a bunch of Republicans and then he beat the Democrats. And in 2016, you had this kind of sense in the Democratic Party that everything's fine. We got this. There's been some problems with the financial crisis and the Tea Party, but Obama is sort of taking care of things. And we've got, Google and Facebook and Amazon, which are these progressive forces. So it's fine. And then in 2016, Trump shocks everyone and wins. And there's this rethink on the Democratic and liberal side of our priors. I had sort of been there before. I was a Brandeisian and had done some things before that I wasn't part of that consensus, but most people were. And I think it's from sort of 2016, 2015 on to 2020, you've seen this broad rethink of a whole bunch of political economy assumptions. And central to that is antitrust, although it's not the only, it's not the only part of it. It is a subset of ideology. And so the debates that we're seeing now are about, do we want to have a political economy in a society where you have enormous concentrations of power in the hands of a few? If you don't want to have that, then how do you remediate that? How do you deal with an economy, with a political system which is largely guarded by sort of a guild of experts? How do you break that? How do you make sure that you organize law in a way that is not harmful while sort of restructuring the way that expertise flows? So there's kind of a lot of interesting problems that we're thinking about: the role of courts, role of legislatures, role of politics in antitrust itself, and then the chaos of our elections and our politics in general is an overlay. So what I think is going to happen over the next, the antitrust subcommittee is part of that. What I think is going to happen over the next, 5 to 10 to 20 years, assuming we don't go to war with China, which we very well may, but assuming nothing like there are no massive sort of exogenous shocks, which I guess is probably a bad assumption considering the year we've just had. But we're going to continue that rethink. And I suspect that we're going to return to the traditional conception of the American order, which is built on an anti-monopoly tradition that comes from the 1600s and really was stopped in the late 1970s, early 1980s in an anomalous period. I mean, we're living through a very weird period from the early 1980s to today. And I think we're going to sort of move back to what we had before that, although kind of updated for modern cultural and social norms and technology. That's kind of the way I see it.
Can we talk a little bit about the sort of populist versus expert theme that I think is in there? I mean, one of the things that jumps out to me in your work, and I think where we have some similarities and some differences, is I think one of the major culprits in your tale of sort of what's wrong with modern antitrust is you've got this expert guild that's formed, and the expert guild is the ABA antitrust section lawyers, and it's sometimes it's the agencies, and sometimes it's the courts too, who maybe come from that same expert guild. I tend to think of the way I grew up as an antitrust person. I've always done antitrust. I've always thought about antitrust, and so I'm part of it too, right? But within that antitrust world, I think we're trained to think about the judges as like the generalist guys who don't know anything about antitrust. And frankly, most of the agency commissioners don't come from an antitrust background. There's, Bill Kovacic, when he was confirmed as a commissioner, he had this article in the late 90s that said, hey, we meant to design this expert agency and we've largely failed, right? If you look at the sort of quality of appointments over time from an expertise perspective, you can measure from lots of other dimensions. We just haven't done it. I think there's been 3 economist commissioners. I think I was the 3rd. No, I was the 4th, sorry. And so in the water that, the Kool-Aid I came up drinking inside the antitrust guild, it was the courts and the agencies are, the agencies more so because they've got this expert staff, but not the generalist Article 3 guys in the robe with robes. They're not, antitrust intelligentsia. And so I guess what I want to push on or sort of hear more about, and then you've got Congress, which, inside the antitrust sort of institutions is a, do-gooder interferer that doesn't know what they're doing and is going to do more harm than good. And I got myself in trouble at the FTC because Congress would ask for non-public briefings on cases. They would do it from time to time. Most of the time, I didn't vote no on all of them, but most of the time it was, somebody in their jurisdiction's involved as a complainant or a defendant, and they want to go, rattle the agency around. And my instinct was, no, we're going to bring the cases we're going to bring and leave us alone, and we'll go win or lose in federal court. I voted no when Republicans asked for this. I voted no when Democrats asked for this. And I would vote yes if they said, we're going to investigate. We've got an industry set, like the House thing, I would have voted yes. They're doing an investigation. Maybe they're going to legislate. And I'd vote yes on those. But my general view was nothing good has ever really come out of congressional involvement. And, and they want to legislate to legislate. That's a little bit different. But in your view of what's wrong with modern antitrust and who the culprits are, this theme is failure to govern, right? It's the agencies have powers they don't use. Congress can legislate and hasn't, right? They've not done anything to change the Clayton Act, or they've not done anything with this, that, or the other. And then you got the lawyers and who's part of that expert versus sort of Democrat, that tension between a Democratic populist vision of antitrust and the experts. Who are the culprits? If I've got the tale of what the failures are right, and if I don't, please correct me.
Well, so okay, it's a hard question, right? Because I'm not against expertise. I think populism is often misportrayed as a sort of resentment of experts, and it's not. The populists in the 1880s and 1890s were very much they sought empirical evidence. They wanted data. They wanted to have a government that knew a lot about the economy. A character in my book is Wright, who was a congressman from Texas, and he actually never went to college, but he is deeply knowledgeable about all sorts of areas in business and banking, and he had his staff putting out lots of reports just to educate the public on how businesses operated. And he was, you could argue, he also was the sponsor of the bill that ultimately became the National Science Foundation. And he was very technologically forward. and deeply interested in how the economy actually worked. I think the problem with the way that the antitrust establishment works, and I actually would pin this on economists in general, and not just IO, industrial organization economists, but economics today, I see it is not designed to uncover truth. I mean, there are people in economics who do that. There are people who are not. But that's only incidental to the purpose of economics. The purpose of economics, whether it's at the Federal Reserve or at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs that handles cost-benefit analysis for regulations, or the Congressional Budget Office or OMB, which are designed to address how legislation works, or industrial organizational economists, it's a language of governance. It's designed to exclude the public from having influence over a political economy. So I think experts and expertise are incredibly important, but they have to serve public policymakers who then make public policy decisions and have the confidence to make those decisions. And what I've seen, and I think the sort of current, antitrust establishment world, but also the Federal Reserve and a whole bunch of other areas, there is a reification of expertise such that economists kind of are making all sorts of value judgments because they spent a few years getting a PhD, and they look down upon the public and upon voters. And fundamentally, when you're thinking about how you structure markets and corporations and banks, these are social decisions. These are political decisions. They're not decisions that you can just sort of say, well, I know the most efficient or right answer. That's just a kind of hitting at democracy. And I'd say, like, one example in the book, and it's not the, I don't go into this deeply, but one area where the Congress was incredibly helpful to the agencies was during World War II with the Truman Commission, when the Bone Commission, a series of others, where what effectively happened at the sort of the beginning of World War II was a suspension of antitrust cases by the Army and Navy. And what happened is that the Truman Committee picked up the slack and exposed and investigated a lot of different monopolies and corruption, which then they could move to the executive branch. But just the fact that Congress was investigating was really powerful. And you've seen this over and over and over. So you saw this with, I think, Estes Kefauver. He investigated a series of cartel cases, which eventually became the GE Westinghouse cases in 1959, 1960, around price fixing around electric utility equipment. And Phil Hart, when he was investigating and trying to legislate with the Industrial Reorganization Act, some of the content that he found, that his staff found, they moved to DOJ, which helped with the IBM case and the AT&T case. And so I don't necessarily divide the world up between agencies and then the dummies in Congress. I'm much more of a fan of Congress. I think that democracy, our republic, works well when our members of Congress do as much as they can to actually know and understand the economy. And I think that the FTC was established partially as a research agency to help Congress make policy. So obviously you came up in a very different time. You came to antitrust way before I did, in a different time, in a different moment. But when I look at these institutions, I think Congress needs to be much more involved in political economy decisions. I think that the Federal Reserve should not be independent, and that I would prefer that the Federal Reserve be run by a committee, maybe some people in the executive branch, Treasury, Department, Labor Secretary, and then some members of Congress. I mean, the way that we run our political economy institutions is designed to shield them from democratic influence. And I think that is one of the key reasons why there is so much anger and frustration on behalf of the public right now.
Yeah. So look, this is actually, at least on the last part, is probably an area where we agree. One of the areas that I sort of changed my mind after becoming a commissioner was A question I had not thought a lot about when I went up for confirmation was every couple of years there's this proposed legislation about bringing the FTC under OIRA review as an independent agency for rulemaking or whatever. And I hadn't thought about it that much. And I looked up what smart Republicans had said and smart Democrats too, in response to that when they were up for confirmation. And they all sort of sang the same song or read the same page of the playbook, which was our independence is really important. And we have lots of economists in the building. And we kind of do an implicit cost benefit analysis of everything we do. So we're fine, leave us alone. Independence trumps the rest of it. So no oversight from us, from the White House, none from Congress, leave us alone. And by the time I left, I had testified in Congress in favor of some form of OIRA review. And it's not the only kind of oversight you could have, but as one form of oversight, frankly, because my view, and I raised the example because I think for a lot of the people who are listening, who are more familiar with the FTC than the Fed, the idea that the economists are running the FTC is one that's going to rub a lot of people as wrong. It certainly rubs me as wrong. Although I have sympathy for the broader point, I have complained myself about the economics profession, sort of the mathematical fetishization, getting to the point where people can't nobody retails economics anymore. Maybe the last really successful wave of retail of economics was the old school Chicago law and economics movement, who sold it to judges and they sold it to policymakers and so forth, because they cared about retail. The Henry Mannies of the world and the Milton Friedmans of the world and the George Stiglers of the world, who might catch your ire for other ideas or things that they've done, cared deeply about retail. Henry Manny built a law school based on it, and they write my paychecks. They care deeply about retail.
Selling the ideas to judges, not like the retail industry.
Right. I mean, to the public. I mean, it was judges, but it was to the public. It was enough that when this wave of decisions happened, it wasn't judges who went to the LEC writing them. It was Scalia and RBG and unanimous opinions, right? So right. The effect happened well outside judges. It had influenced the general population, but
no, I mean, I developed a kind of respect for the marketing genius of particularly Aaron Director, who I think was, I guess he didn't write that much, but he's really kind of an unspoken, he's not well understood. And, the first draft of the chapter on the Chicago school that I wrote was centered on Bork. And then, I gave it to a mentor to look at, and he was like, no, the real character here, based on what you've written, is Aaron Director. You need to figure out what his thinking was. And I learned that he was heavily influenced by H.L. Mencken and Thurston Veblen, and had, and like Milton Friedman and John Kenneth Galbraith in some ways, who was very influenced by both Mencken and Veblen, more Veblen. But they had a kind of both belief in education, educating the public, but also a kind of contempt for the establishment. And I get that. And I think that came from Aaron Director and Milton Friedman. They were, they're Jewish in the 20s, and that's not a fun time to be Jewish in America. And Aaron Director had, he came from Russia, and he was 13, moves to Portland. Portland is the city that is dominated by, outside of the South in the 20s, Portland, Oregon is, dominated by the KKK more than any other city in America, maybe. And so this is a Jewish kid from Russia, right? And he's there. And then he goes to Yale. Again, not a fun place to be if you're Jewish in the 20s. I guess maybe the teens and 20s. And he's heavily influenced by this desire to educate, but also a deep distrust of democracy, because what he saw was, it didn't work out for people like him. And that was like a lot of the dynamics that were set up around, and this was also Hofstadter, who was another big character in my book, and, Daniel Bell and a series of others, the kind of taking over of the academic citadels in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. There was a tremendous sense that kind of WASP establishment was really unfair, and in particular unfair to people like them, which was, I think, pretty true. So I got that sense, and I I respected the achievements and their desire to educate and their desire to really have those kinds of fights. I also think it was really cynical. I think there was a lot of nihilism there, and Mencken was a nihilist. I mean, he was deeply cynical. So I think that's kind of like, I ultimately didn't conclude that I respected the endeavor. I thought I respected the energy and the effort, but I did ultimately come to the conclusion. I thought it was more of a marketing effort than it was a real attempt to understand the world, and come out with a and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but that is the conclusion that I came to about the Chicago School. It was not my first conclusion. At first, I thought these people really had a certain vision of liberty and freedom. And then after really looking at Aaron Director, I was like, oh no, this guy's just a cynic. And so that's what, you can see with Friedman and Stigler, they changed their mind about monopoly. And I just get that sense that that's what they were after. Yeah.
Sure. And look, my view of Stigler changing his mind is he changed it when the empirical evidence in the 70s changed. I mean, people started running cross-sectional regressions, and there's Demsetz and Stigler and all those guys, and he looked and he said, I changed my mind. I think it's a little bit of both. I'm not one of these economists or lawyers who thinks ideology is a bad word. There's no doubt that the Chicago School is highly ideological, right. Just like the economists are highly ideological.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't think you have an accent, that's the way ideology is. Oh, well, I don't have an accent, you do, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. Everybody has a constitutive ideological framework that they operate, and I think we should just be honest about that. And I just kind of and I think that the Chicago School was generally more honest about it because they had to be, because they were sitting outside the the sort of the citadels of academia and the establishment. But this is the other thing. I think the thing that distinguishes my book from a lot of the traditional kind of center left critiques, or the story that I tell is, and my belief too is I came up under, my political education happened under Obama, and I was sort of wondering, why is it that my party made decisions in a crisis caused by concentration of wealth and power? Why did my party choose to concentrate wealth and power in response to that? And I really tried to figure it out. And what I found is that there were a series of crises in the 1970s. I mean, this came from sort of early deregulation of banking in the 1950s and 60s, which is not something that I think a lot of people had looked at. The Wright Patman and Walter Wriston of Citibank were right in the middle of. And, Eurodollar markets and the train systems and this is something that, the crises of those decades, the bankruptcy of Penn Central in 1970 kind of kicks it off, but you can go forward to Pan Am and even New York City almost went bankrupt. That really caused a kind of psychological shock to, everyone who was thinking about political economy. And I think that's what's missing from the kind of broad understanding of how we think about these debates today. It really wasn't just, in the sort of the telling, I think the narrative of the left is, there was the Powell memo and people kind of on the right realized, oh, we want to take everything over. But I mean, that's what didn't totally grok with me. So I realized, okay, no, actually they were responding to something, which was the breakdown of this kind of New Deal order. And they were ideological. The law and economics school was ideological, but they had a specific set of arguments about why things were breaking down. And the left, the populists, there were a few old ones left over like Patman and Phil Hart and a couple of others, but they largely didn't have any answers. They hadn't thought about the problem for 20 years. And so they accepted, I think, the arguments from the law and economics school kind of wholesale. And that's why in 1979, 1980, 1981, you saw this like total acceptance of the new, the new learning, as it were, by the kind of the liberal establishment. And then, you roll that forward to Trinko and it's unanimous decisions. And Clinton and Obama, neither of them really reversed any of the things that Reagan or Bush had done. And so that's why there's this weird cultural disjunction on the Democratic side. But I think on the Republican side, you're seeing the same thing because those debates happened on the Republican side as well. I'm less familiar with those debates on the 1970s, but I didn't put this in the book, but I did see there were a lot of the new right movement in 1978, they hated monopolies. I mean, they hated monopolies in the same way that I would have said I hate monopolies, right? They were not Borkians. I mean, they eventually became Borkians, but that, 1978, that's Newt Gingrich's class. And so that debate kind of happened, and I'm less familiar with the contours there. But I think that debate is reemerging now on the right because of largely social media and technology platforms, but also the kind of heavily concentrated nature of our economy. So I'd be curious to hear what I liked your piece about the sort of conservative arguments, but what's your sense? Why is that consensus on the right breaking down?
It's a good question. And I think, look, the first time that I realized that something different was happening on the left was there was some debate over merger policy. And I think this was probably on Twitter, but I had, within antitrust institutions, if I ever say that Steve Salop or Carl Shapiro agree with me, it's the end of the debate. Everybody, it's done. It's not worth talking about. And I think I might be getting this wrong, Matt, but it was either you, this was like early Twitter. It might have even been our first interaction. It was either you, might have been Marshall Steinbaum, but I think it was you who said, like, look at these clowns from the Obama DOJ agreeing with Josh. None of these guys are right. And I think the thing got like 10, a bunch of retweets. It's like, oh, there's a different thing happening on the left than I'm used to. And you sort of see that playing out. There's, Fiona and, other people. There's sort of debates from within and outside. And I think on the right, you're getting, one of the reasons I wrote that piece that's in National Affairs was because I think that same moment is happening on the right. I think that the language being discussed on the right, look, there's a lot of pent up frustration at the tech firms because they're thought of as an arm of the Democratic political party. And, you go and you look at political donations at these firms and they're 99 to 1%. They look like law schools, right? They're 99 to 1 in terms of the political donations. And, I participated on the Trump transition and I got to talk to Peter Thiel a lot during that time period, and I knew him prior. And you would hear guys, Peter said this in writing somewhere, so I'm not spilling state secrets or anything, but he said, hey, look, these guys evaded prosecution because they had a tight relationship, with the Obama administration. I happen to not think I don't think there was a case. I think they would have lost the 2015 case for lots of reasons. But you got where the political feeling about it was coming from. You've got this sort of bubble around the tech firms, and the way we normally think about sort of bubbles popping is you put somebody in office that's going to regulate the hell out of you. They regulate the hell out of you. You internalize the cost, and we get to whatever the equilibrium is, and they avoided that. And now the sort of narrative on the right is, election interference and censorship, and those firms are mean to conservatives, and we ought to do something. And hey, antitrust is something. And in fact, it's a big something with a big hammer with really powerful remedies. I think it attracts a lot of political attention because of that. You can make up remedies. There's not a lot of limits to what you can do in terms of injunctive relief, whether that's breaking people up or redesigning platforms or what have you. So I get why it's attractive, but it was no longer the case where you could walk into a room with conservatives and say, hey, these rules are efficient and make the pie bigger, and have anybody necessarily care, right? The side that already agreed with you would leave already agreeing with you, and the side that didn't say, but are we gonna let the bad guys get away? Or are we gonna shoot them with this antitrust thing? And so I think that that split on the right, I mean, you tweet a lot about the things that Senator Hawley has done, and he's certainly one of the prominent voices and sort of did stuff when he was Missouri State AG. The one that really got my attention was Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was at the FTC. Ted Cruz has been a staunch consumer welfare guy. That's the biggest flip for me, that at least in the Senate side said, hey, If you look on the conservative side in the Senate to find people who think about antitrust like I do, or close, Mike Lee, maybe
Right.
maybe one or two more. Watching that turn, I think, has been the most interesting development, because I think that sort of populist turn. Now I worry a lot, because antitrust today, sort of compared to what, and this gets us to some of the substance of what the other proposals are, compared to what else you might do. I don't by any means think that the current system is perfect. I led the world in dissents, and they weren't all about not bringing cases. Most of them were. I did plenty of things I would move around. But I think a lot of the alternatives are things that I think would make the world worse off in terms of the sort of consumer surplus lens. And so the big question I'm left with these guys is, what are we getting in exchange? Right?
Well, let me ask a couple of questions about that. So, okay. Yeah. So first of all, how do you, when you look around, so I think that there's a broader reorientation happening, and it's I think certainly the perception on the conservative side that these companies are, progressive is one of the overarching themes. But there are also a number of reconceptualizations that are happening of political economy in general because of the financial crisis, right? Not just the that had, I think, that shocked everyone, right? And when I talk to younger Republicans, they're like, yeah, I was a libertarian, and then the financial crisis happened, and I'm not anymore. And very similar effect to one that happened to me. I was not a libertarian, but this is sort of a similar shock. But you see Orrin Cass, Tucker Carlson is much, very different in the way that he talks about these problems. J.D. Vance and Ken Buck, Ken Buck was really influenced by the entrepreneurs, right? It wasn't the conservative bias that or perceived conservative bias that got him.
That's right.
Entrepreneurship. So, I guess I kind of wonder, what's your answer? Like, they're looking at this, they're saying, small business formation is going down. There is tremendous inequality, and it's a political problem. And there seems to be some serious issues in how kind of financial monopolists or financiers are organizing our social resources in ways that are not innovative or are harmful. What's your answer? You're gonna have to come up with a theory, right? To sort of say, hey, this is how we're going to attack these problems. Or do you just not think, you just sort of reject the idea that there are these problems in our political economy?
It's a good question. The toughest one for me, obviously. And I think, so there's been a whole menu of problems asserted in the American economy. And it is true that for a good part of that menu, I think we could have a fun fight about the premise, right? I think the data on, for example, small business dynamism, it's missing most small firms in it. It's really hard to tell what's in the data. But I take that seriously. The data on income inequality, I take seriously. There are other things. U.S. merger policy has failed because there are a bunch of anti-competitive mergers that go through that people don't catch. I disagree. The firms in digital economies, the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, don't face competitive pressure and aren't generating huge amounts of consumer surplus. Disagree. Lack of the agencies, inability of the agencies to win cases because the modern antitrust laws don't let them. Disagree.
No, I don't mean to. Let's just take, let's just say, okay, I know what you think about antitrust, and let's just say that you're right about all of that. Okay, let's just stipulate you're right. Or on the legal and some of the policy merits. Are you just saying the status quo is fine? Is that what you're saying? That the populist pressure, the people that are frustrated, they're just wrong? What's your And if not, then what's your theory of what needs to change?
So, okay, I got you. So a couple of things, right? So the populists who point out changes in income inequality aren't wrong about what the data says about income inequality. They're right about that. My issue is I think that the cost of dealing that indirectly through antitrust versus dealing with that directly, if that's something that we want to do, I guess I'm giving the standard IO economist here, which is the policy tool to do that directly is better than doing it indirectly through antitrust. Because what I worry about, I've seen the proposals to deal with this through antitrust, and they're mostly not that well targeted, right? They're mostly not about income inequality. We talk about handing over income inequality policy decision-making to the agencies who sued Whole Foods to bring down the price of organic quinoa. I mean, the idea that we're going to solve income inequality problems through giving expansive antitrust authority powers to the FTC and DOJ seems to me like a really bad idea. We're going to mostly make people worse off. I think that's the history of doing expansive antitrust. But I don't deny at all that there are real problems in the economy, and income inequality, I think, is a fair one. And I hate to sound like an antitrust guy who just says, don't use my tool, have someone else do it. But that's what I'm saying. I mean, don't use my tool and go to Congress and let them do it.
Right. So moving out of antitrust, you've written on a number of things. You're prolific. I think you have over 100 papers on SSRN, which it's impressive. So sorry, what?
Good co-authors.
Okay, but presumably the papers. So you have a broader spectrum than just antitrust, and you're very well aware of it. I guess what I'm saying is, and this is more advice than anything else, clearly something's wrong, right? Clearly people are unhappy on both the right and the left, right? Especially younger people, but sort of broadly when you do polling on, there's a general inchoate dissatisfaction, and we can argue about the technical specifics of what to do. Are you saying that nothing is, I'm asking for a positive, not normative judgment, although I always get those two confused. So just, what is wrong, if something, broadly speaking, where is this coming from? And then what's the best way to address it? Maybe it's not antitrust, but it's some other set of policies. Like, what's your view? Like, let's say I'm Ken Buck and I come to you and I say, okay, Josh, I know you don't want to use any of these antitrust tools, but I'm getting frustration from people in my district, and kind of we're hearing this across the economy. What do I do? And I can't say don't use this tool, but what do I do? What's an affirmative response? Yeah.
So a couple of things, and depends on what they're trying to solve, obviously, right? So a couple of things, right? One, I think for a lot of the areas around innovation policy, so I think the administration has screwed up everything to do with human capital and immigration. So for one, and that is something Ken Buck has talked a lot about, for example, I think we've screwed up a lot in that area. I think a lot around small business and dynamism, we can focus on, acquisition by tech competitors, which is what Ken Buck focused on. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I don't think that that's what the problem is, nor do I think you need a change in antitrust laws to do it, right? So I'll give you an example there. If you really think that the problem that's being diagnosed is what's killing small business dynamism is, Google and Facebook and Amazon come and buy small guys up out of the garage and then go kill the products, a la killer acquisition, or, they buy them and they develop them and, we've somehow dampened incentives for innovation. And the problem, and many have said this is the problem, the agencies don't see those, right? There's too many of them. This is part of Ken Buck's report too. There's too many of these small things. Notify the agencies, change HSR and notify the agencies so they make sure that they're reviewing all of them, right? You could tinker with the HSR requirements if you really think that that's the problem. I don't think that's the problem. And I don't think you do either, right? I mean, I don't think your issue is they go to court and they can't block these. I think your issue and mine is they don't bring enough cases where they think there's a problem. The agencies don't vote.
I actually would say that, well, I mean, if we're going to get to antitrust, specifically, I think that most of these decisions should be out of the courts. And I think there should be clear rules so that they don't have to do it case by case. I think the law enforcement approach is problematic. And so I would just have much more clear rules. You're a certain size, you can't buy anyone, right? Just straight up.
What would you be? It would all be size based?
I haven't thought through those details enough, but yeah, certainly size would be one threshold. I know Amy Klobuchar has a bill saying that if you're $100 billion of market cap or above, no acquisitions. And generally speaking, my view is mergers are generally bad. So if you just blocked all mergers, obviously there are some mergers which are sort of useful when old people have a company and they want to get rid of it because they're retiring. That's one thing. But most mergers are bad. Most mergers don't work out. So if you blocked all mergers, it would be a net win for the economy. You wouldn't require any resources. You just block them. I just think sort of straightforward rules that would get rid of a lot of the sort of bureaucratic and central planning by Article 3 judges. I think the more we could do that, the better. But the other, I think, one question I have for you is, when you look at the judiciary now, one of the things you wrote was that the judiciary is now stocked with immense legal talent, which is I thought that was a nice phrase. How is there a rethinking going on among conservative judges? I saw that statement from Clarence Thomas on Section 230, which was really surprising to me. And then I saw an exchange between Amy Coney Barrett and Josh Hawley on antitrust and economics. And I suspect there isn't, but I'm not in touch with these, with that school of thinking, and I know I'm just kind of interested in how judges learn. And I know you've thought a lot about that and done a lot of work there.
Yeah. So I'll say the following, having just spent a week teaching judges a week ago, which I didn't publicize because I didn't want it in the New York Times again. But what are you going to do? So
you're the only one who takes money in
no, that's right. That's right. Well, I do want to bracket a couple minutes to talk about that. Meaning one of the new things that's happened is the sort of corporate, the antitrust debates now are, Oracle and Apple and Yelp and Walmart and whoever on the left side of the V, on the plaintiff side. And I think that does have a big influence on the politics and the political economy around the space. I want to bracket that because I think that's relatively new. I sat in just to sort of set up what I'm thinking. You can let it sort of rattle around the back of your brain while I answer your question. I sat in a conference not too long ago, symposium at Penn, and Fiona Scott Morton and Herbert Hovenkamp had a paper, and they say, look, the problem with antitrust is it's a different form of I don't know, it's a conspiracy tale about education of judges. It is, look at all of these decisions where the Koch brothers and the Law and Econ Center train all the judges, and they tricked RBG. And the reason, and this is the part that gets me, because I've heard all that before. The part that got me was, the reason is, and this makes sense for all of 10 seconds until you get to second 11, is the monopolists are protecting the monopoly rate of return. And so they're going to outlaw, competition doesn't have a constituency. And so nobody spends money on reforming the antitrust laws to make them tougher. Or on the plaintiff side, well, Apple's gotten everybody in the world to sue Qualcomm. Microsoft's doing just okay, thanks. Walmart's on that side. Oracle on the conservative side is outspending everybody. And it seems like they could have written that paper in the 70s or 80s. But that's not the political economy around antitrust that lives today. I promise I'm not the most well-funded think tank out there. And, not even close. And I think that's, I raise it less because I'm interested in where the money comes from. It's people have ideas and they'll go and fight in the places where you fight with ideas. But I do think it's a lot different, both in terms of implications for that structure for the courts, but also Congress. It makes me think about courts, for example. I don't know how, once a week as an FTC commissioner, somebody came in who was well-heeled and able to sue and said, please sue for us, because we would really like someone who is not us to sue. Name your favorite antitrust defendant. I think you're going to get a ton of private litigation, a lot more private litigation than you had before, a lot more state suing. There's just going to be a lot more antitrust litigation, which I think makes the judge's question that you asked sort of a higher stakes one. To answer it after I just ran around for a little bit, to answer it, I don't think for the new judges that there's been a massive rethink about antitrust. I think the new judges, the Trump judges, and there's a bunch of them, I think for those judges that are drawn from a lot of places, but sort of generally drink from the, originalism, textualism sort of pool. I think for those guys, they read the antitrust decisions that adopt the consumer welfare standard. Nobody wants to touch 9.0 and 8.1 and 7.2 decisions. I don't think that they want to. I think if they're going to have new marching orders, it's going to have to be from Congress. What I've been saying for a long time to anybody who will listen.
Doesn't it seem like a one-way ratchet? I mean, you can, you get, from my perspective, when I look at the courts, and the argument is, it's a common law. It's common law. The, courts interpret these statutes and they update them with sort of as we learn. And to me, when I look at the courts, it just always seems like a one-way ratchet, where it just is always harder for plaintiffs. It's always easier for defendants. And I, that's one of the reasons I don't like putting these decisions. I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons why the courts are the wrong place to make these decisions in general. I mean, appeals are fine, but that's what it seems to me that's what's happening. And since we've seen, I think, enormous, whether you can say that, I'm sure you're not convinced by it, but I think one could say that the bipartisan consensus around antitrust has broken down, right? That there is just a lot of new information and new research that's being done. Do the courts just not care about that? I mean, then, and if they don't care about that new information, then I don't understand the arguments about why, about sort of the common law courts learning as economics updates. It just seems like that's not both of those can't be true.
Can I take a crack at that? I mean, I think part of the history, the reason that it's gone unidirection, one direction, is because everything was illegal in the 50s and 60s. I mean, everything. Where we started was the plaintiff was, Potter Stewart and the dissent in Vaughn's Grocery saying the only thing that's common in Section 7 cases is the government always wins. And that's, 1966. And I think if you look around the decisions in the 60s, tying, exclusive dealing, vertical mergers, horizontal mergers, RPM, everything is illegal and a lot of it criminal, including RPM, right? And so I think there had to be a massive correction in the courts if we were going to have a consumer welfare-oriented antitrust. There had to be. We didn't have to. We could have done something different. But once you bit that part of the camel's nose is inside the tent, and I think that's a good development. But even if you don't, once that happened, well, everything was illegal, including a lot of stuff that improved consumer welfare. And the new information that was coming in, say horizontal mergers or vertical mergers or RPM, was this stuff is not anti-competitive 100% of the time. Maybe it's 50, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 80, right? But it's not 100. And so you had all this case by case doctrine emerge based on new information. The RPM decision, Legion is all based on new information. Weyerhaeuser, new information. And I think as you get this new stuff, right, there's lots of valuable, I think the stuff on common ownership now is really interesting. I think a lot of the empirical work in labor markets is really interesting and important, has changed the way I've thought about both of those topics. I think a lot of that stuff is new and important. And I think what's going to happen in the courts, because we've gone to case-by-case analysis, sort of case-by-case rules, I don't think you need a change to Section 7 to go after labor market cases. I think you can do it right now. I don't think you need a change in the law. I think the case-by-case approach allows you to do it right now. So to me, I think the courts have been sensitive to new information, if not with a 10-year lag or something like that. It's not, they're not markets, so they're not perfectly efficient, Matt. They take some time, right? But I do think they've been sensitive to that over time. And I think that that's a good thing. Whether the bipartisan consensus has broken down, I think there's still within antitrust institutions a bipartisan consensus that we ought to take the new evidence and data and design antitrust rules around the set of rules that maximize consumer welfare. I'm not willing to let go of the idea that there might be a consensus around the consumer welfare standard. I think that there's lots of debate over, shouldn't you bring more cases in this area or that area? Now, that consensus ain't what it used to be. I'm not in denial about that. I think that there are louder voices saying, let's break the whole thing down. Yours among them. But I'm not sure. So if you look at the House report, right, and the Ken Buck stuff and the way that those hearings went, Ken Buck's not willing to say do away with the consumer welfare standard. None of those Republicans are, and the House majority goes way out of their way. They're going to overturn 20 Supreme Court decisions and an Easterbrook Law Review article from the 80s, but they won't say overturn Wright versus Sonotone. They won't say get rid of the consumer welfare standard, because you couldn't put out a bipartisan, you couldn't draw Ken Buck, you couldn't do. So I don't think that's going anywhere, is my kind of punchline. Am I as confident in that as I was, say, 5 years ago? Not even close. But I think it's an overstatement to say the consensus around keeping that, even if it means we disagree about bringing more cases or something like that. I look at the agency win rate in merger cases. Lost 3 litigated cases in the last decade. They announced they're gonna challenge, and everybody folds. I don't see a crisis of the law being in the wrong place.
Well, so that makes sense. I was more referring to, people are kind of, the consumer welfare standard is this elastic thing. And I think one of the ways that you see, an attempt to preserve, maybe I'll start by saying, so both the Democrats and the Republicans, as we've talked about, that have been in important policymaking roles and enforcement roles, have tended to obviously adhere to the consumer welfare standard, and they don't necessarily want to break from that, right? You haven't had the new learning moment, right? The new learning moment is, I think, super fast. It's really interesting. And I thought it was kind of incredible branding in mid 70s when you had all of these people, including Bill Baxter, who said, I was a structuralist, right? And then I saw the light, right? And I thought that was very powerful as a way of changing people's minds. And I think people's minds have changed, but they don't want to kind of admit it. They don't want to say, I was wrong, right? We somehow haven't yet validated that choice. So the new learning is kind of, it's a kind of born again moment where you actually get credit. If everybody says they're wrong at the same time, then it becomes the cool thing to do, right? And now we're in this moment where everyone sort of says, not you obviously, but a lot of people say, the consumer welfare standard could handle, labor monopsony, and it can handle innovation, and it can handle, and it's not just about prices, and it's, it's kind of like being stretched into something beyond recognition, because I think people just don't want to admit that they have changed their mind, even though they have changed their mind. So that's the way that I look at the dynamic. But when I was referring to the consensus, I meant that the consensus, that price theory was the right way to think about mergers and antitrust, right? As opposed to structuralism. So, I think Carl Shapiro, there's a quote from him in 2017 saying, there's been a lot of debate over concentration. There was much less, but still a lot in 2017 versus previous periods. And he says, us antitrust economists, we shrug our shoulders, right? He doesn't care about concentration and potential links to profits, because concentration's doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. What matters is price theory. Are the prices changing, or are the outputs changing? And that, I think the consensus there has broken down. So that's specifically what I mean. I think there just is concern that there's a lot more concentration than there was. I imagine you don't believe this, but that consensus has broken down.
To the extent that the argument is I think it is certainly true that if you gathered a bunch of IO economists and antitrust economists in a room and said, do you care about concentration for concentration's sake, or for a reason other than competitive outcomes?
Well,
right?
not IO economists, right? Because IO economists are, there's a gatekeeper there or series of gatekeepers there who don't let you in that club unless you believe certain priors. When I say a consensus, I mean, the consensus, the formation of that consensus has moved away from the guild, right? It's moved towards more democratic bodies like Congress and state legislators. So, where they're having these debates now, they said, oh, actually, this is not, banks and corporations are political institutions, right? That's the sort of the broad realization. And so the public is kind of running in and into your party and saying, we're here now. You didn't.
Oh yeah, okay. So I agree with that. There are certainly a lot of more people crashing the party, if you will, saying, thinking about this metric about the way you do it is no longer the right way to think about it. I'm not sure if any of that. So I thought for a moment you were connecting that to sort of the new economic evidence that's out there, which I think is largely within the party, not outside.
Well, I mean, it's response to it's largely a response to this public dissatisfaction. So I look at the sort of guild, and I think of them as, and the economic experts, they lag reality by 10 years. So we were offshoring huge amounts of work from China in the mid 2000s. And you had people who were losing their jobs saying, this is terrible. You had people protesting. And then, 2013, 14, a bunch of economists write something called the China shock. And all of a sudden economists say, oh, whoa, it turns out that we were offshoring a lot of jobs. We didn't know that. And it's because they were hearing people say it, but those weren't people to them. Those were just, they weren't credentialed. So they weren't people. They're just because it was somebody who lost their job or somebody who said this is a bad idea, an engineer, a supply chain engineer, whatever, or someone from Wall Street saying move the factories, it's good for your profits. That wasn't relevant information. That was all anecdotal. So that's what I mean is the arguments have been, I think, largely the evidence that's been uncovered. The research has largely been driven by this broad public anger that's forcing the professions to confront what they weren't looking at before.
Yeah, and to me, where I see the equilibrium, and who knows if my crystal ball is any good. You had a tweet not too long ago where I think we exchanged about what a Biden administration might
right.
look.
Who knows?
and who knows? And you probably know better than I do. I don't get invited to. Probably there are parties that get invited to that I don't on that side. But my sense is, my sense was sort of skeptical that you'd see, I thought you'd see, Obama and a tick left, right? Half a standard deviation to the left of Obama. And I think the courts are constrained on that. And I guess I'm sort of cynical Congress passes anything major, because in part my view, and just to sort of air out my assumptions, part of my assumptions about Congress not changing anything are because Congress doesn't often change things. And I'm not, not saying that's good or bad, just it's a prediction.
No, it's true.
Right? And that was positive, not normative. But, where I think the action is here is, a handful more challenges here, here and there, maybe more labor cases than there used to be, maybe a common ownership. I think you could do all that stuff under the existing law. But another reason why I think you're not going to see as, as big of a shift or movement from Congress is, by my lights, on the right on the politics. Let me do one political point and one sort of antitrusty point. On the right on the politics, I think the message of guys like me in the essay I wrote, for example, that was targeted at people who disagree with me, who want to, on the right, who want to use antitrust to do stuff that you want to do with antitrust, right? Or at least some of it, right? And my approach in those audiences is often to say, and I've said this, every time I can in those audiences, is if you take these proposals sort of whole hog, you are definitely going to you're going to definitely make consumers, people worse off, right? You're going to take money out of people's pocketbooks. And in exchange for what? What are you getting in return for the deal? And to the right, the answer has been, short run gratification that I got to slap a tech firm in the face. And I'm not sure that wins the political day. On the left, I think the answer is different. You are going to get some other things in the political calculus that I think are sort of satisfying. My guess on that is, I don't know. I don't know. But on the right, I think when push comes to shove on some of the big ticket items, undoing consumer welfare standards, size-based thresholds, those sorts of things, I think those people still believe that they're going to be trading off consumer wealth in exchange for something. And I think the game is the something, if it is short run political gratification by hitting big tech firms, is that enough? And I think the Google suit in a shift in the election, I don't know, maybe that makes it worse. Maybe it makes it better. I don't know, but that's at least the way I see it playing out on that side. The other thing I want to say there, and then I'll shut up and let you respond, is a really interesting thing, and I'd love to get your take on it, is that let's say we agree that Congress isn't going to do much, because Congress doesn't do much, and the courts aren't going to move because Supreme Court's where it is for a while. The other kind of animal is competition rulemaking, and Commissioner Chopra in particular has been pushing this, the sort of idea of bright line rules, and that's not new in consumer protection, but doing it in competition, which I know is an ideal I think that intellectually appeals to you. And I think my guess is one real possibility is that a really important dimension of antitrust becomes rulemaking.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, you could line up all the ABA antitrust section lawyers in the world and ask them admin law questions, and you won't get a lot of answers. It's not what they do. And so I think you see like the antitrust bar push back really hard on rulemaking. One of the reasons I wanted to do the Section 5 statement, and Commissioner Chopra has been, very, I'm grateful, but he's been very kind about pointing out that the unbounded nature of Section 5 was bad. We ought to have clearer rules, and he would go clearer than I did, right? With the rest of the agency. But I think that at least in the short-term future, and for a Biden FTC, whoever they put it, if you can't win in the courts and you don't get congressional change, the FTC has this big shiny tool in competition rulemaking, and it takes 3 votes. And the new battle turf becomes the DC Circuit with judicial review. The FTC becomes the FCC tomorrow. Everything's through rules, and we do battles through judicial review. I guess the question that's tucked in there is, we've talked some about how you see the appropriate role of Congress, and we've talked about the courts. And agencies are this weird animal, right? And independent agencies in particular. So do you have a reaction or a thought to the idea about competition rulemaking? I guess one, in the sense that I'm envisioning bright line rules, which I'm guessing you like. But in terms of accountability with the agency and the relationship between agency and the courts and Congress, is that a good place for antitrust policy to go?
Yes, I think it is. I like rulemaking for the FTC. I think it's clearer than, depending on how the rules are written, of course. So that's definitely a place. And I also think that, the FTC was sort of designed as a way to get around courts. The courts were a big problem in 1913. They had just implemented the rule of reason. And, Woodrow Wilson and Brandeis and populists and progressives built the FTC as a way of circumventing the court's emasculation of the Sherman Act. And one of the tools that they did offer to the FTC was was Section 5 unfair methods of competition. So I don't see any reason why you wouldn't want to use that to address conflicts of interest. And there are a bunch of other tools as well that they could use, but I think that's a big one. I do want to sort of offer a slightly different view on I think sort of the path of antitrust and competition policy in general, which is, I think if you look back the last 5 years and you were to say, where is anti-monopoly policy going to go? And then you came to today and you saw a conservative Republican administration trying to break up a $1 trillion company and another potential suit, from the FTC against Facebook coming probably soon. And then this Congress, Cicilline doing this in-depth 16-month report and investigation of these tech firms with Republican support. I think you would have to say, which moves power from the courts to the legislature, which is a huge change, just a massive change. And then all of this discussion, a unanimous issuance of subpoenas for the tech CEOs in the Senate Commerce Committee, which didn't really even get a news story because it was just like, that's how much it's changed, right? I think you'd have to look at the overall political and legal environment and say, it's nothing like it was, right? It's a massive change. And so to have, a suit by the government under Trump a Section 2 suit to try to break up Google, and then another one likely from the FTC to try to address Facebook, and I don't know what they're going to do. Plus, that $5 billion fine, which people forget about, which I thought was weak, but that's still $5 billion, biggest fine ever. These are really big changes, and I suspect that that's going to continue, and I think that because the driving factors behind those changes are still there, and those driving factors are, first of all, we have a swollen, misshapen economy at this point. You've seen this with the financial crisis and too big to fail banks, which is too big to fail. You've seen this with the pandemic, which hit our supply chains in ways that we've never really experienced as a country. You've seen, the role of social media in restructuring how we relate to one another, and that's just, these are just extraordinary pressures on our culture. I think from what I've been told from social conservatives, it's not just the censorship, that's the anti-conservative bias, which you've written about. That was actually that National Affairs article that you mentioned it. It's also evangelical women who have kids don't like what social media is doing to their kids, right? It's not just and it's not a consumer welfare. They just don't like it. They don't think it's doing good things as a parent, right? That's where I started hearing it on the right, 5 or 6 years ago. And then I think you have this attack, a perceived attack on culture, right? Which is something that's really important on the right. I mean, it's important on the left and on the Democratic side too, but on the right there is an explicit conversation about culture, and there is a sort of a sense that this is having detrimental effects. And then you have corporate America, which increasingly looks like the Fortune 5 versus everyone else, and battles there. And you have monopolization in lots of areas of the economy that are not the big guys. Like, I've written a lot about cheerleading, which is just crazy that you have a cheerleading monopolist. But you see that everywhere. You can look in pretty much any part of the economy and you will see a level of concentration that is, coin operated laundries is what I'm looking into now, and elevator installation, and all of these weird places. Everybody who works in the economy feels under the thumb of someone else. So this kind of pressure is building a political reaction. I think part of that political reaction was Trump. And I think you're seeing more and more political reaction coming in both parties, sort of a deep sense that something is really wrong. You see, arguments for socialism now, which are kind of a part of this. John Sherman would talk about in the 1890s. But you're just seeing all of these. A friend of mine put it, this sort of the swamp things emerge, and I don't think that's going to stop until we get a hold of this concentrated power and start breaking it up, or in contrast, that concentrated power just wins and takes it all over, which is in my view, that's an authoritarian. Then we just move to sort of a fully authoritarian society, with a tech sector that's kind of like China's, which is heavily integrated into the government. You sort of see some of this. This is not something this is being pushed I think in the national security world, it's also being pushed on both the right and the left in different ways. On the left, it's Mark Zuckerberg needs to censor to like protect our elections, and then on the right, it's a lot of the, I think, anti-conservative stuff. But I think you see more broadly the pressure, the economic pressure that a lot of people are now feeling. It isn't just it's not just people in poverty, or it's kind of everybody feels it in their own way. And I don't think that's going to stop until we make changes to our political economy policy making to make that stop. So, and the other things, I think Congress, the big thing that we know, I do think that Congress is going to pass new laws because they're hearing it. Members of Congress are hearing this every day. But regardless, Congress is going to be way more involved in this stuff than it has. And that's, I think, a big change.
I think that is a big change. And I certainly agree that you're going to see more involvement. What sort of legislation comes out of it? I think it's certainly more of a threat today than there was a year ago, that you would see sort of massive, big change antitrust legislation. I think that's absolutely right. That you'll see more of that. The politics of it with the pandemic, I think, have been pretty interesting too. I think in some of the firms, I think, have done better for themselves than others in terms of the politics during the pandemic, and sort of what's the right word? Sort of popular sentiment about who the appropriate targets are in the sort of culture wars you were describing. Amazon and Facebook aren't the same on that margin, for example. If we're just measuring, public sentiment to pressure.
Right. Every monopolist is a special snowflake. But you also see things like Boeing, right, which is a disaster, and that was a monopoly that was orchestrated by the Clinton administration for geostrategic regions. It's sort of a national champion, and you had some economies of scale arguments in there as well. But the McDonnell Douglas Boeing merger was part of that neoliberal turn, but also the end of the Cold War. And now, in 2018, you would have been hard pressed to find someone who talked about how Boeing was a problematic company because it hit $100 billion that year. It was more profitable than it had ever been, and it was this sort of shining example of American export prowess. And what was masking, the market power was masking the underlying deterioration in its productive capacity. And I think you've seen that, like you're starting to see, it's increasingly difficult to look at corporate America and see what you saw maybe in the 80s and before, which was a group of companies that, whatever you thought about their market power, were good at managing industrial arts, we're good at making things, we're good at distributing things, we're competent. And that's going away. It's increasingly, you're seeing like the 737 MAX everywhere. And I think the same thing is, you don't see this with some of the tech platforms. People still think that their productive capacity is really strong. I suspect that's true about, just based on what I can see, I think that there's something to that, the same dynamic where they're a little bit like the American auto industry in the 1960s, where they seemed like they were on top of the world, but it was really market power masking the underlying productive capacity deterioration. I think that's something we're going to have to deal with just because of China, and if nothing else. But that's what's coming out as well. And I think that's I don't think there's any way to avoid trying to figure out what to do about that.
Well, let me end with this one. I know we've gone well over, but because I've enjoyed the conversation, I hope you have.
Yeah.
But the example of Boeing, sort of in the back of my head. So I'm a UCLA guy. I was a Harold Demsetz student, and Armin Alchian, and so Harold wrote this sort of, in my world, famous article called Two Systems of Belief About Monopoly, and this is sort of the idea that a lot of barriers to entry rise because of the government, state, local, federal, et cetera. And it was raising the airplanes and the sort of intervention of the federal government there. And normally this conversation happens in competition policy against, occupational licensing is the sort of the big one. And it's been hard for me to follow the split on, I've seen, some commentators on the left get really angry when people talk about fixing occupational licensing. Best I can gather, it is an argument that it's sort of window dressing fix and not going after the real problems. They're not actually in favor of imposing state and local barriers to entry.
No, I am. I'm pro occupational licensing. I think that occupational licensing is a legitimate exercise of state power. So
even where it creates monopoly.
Yeah, I mean, I would prefer that states and cities not do that or try to limit that. But yes, I think it's a completely legitimate. I oppose the FTC and DOJ trying to block cities and states from exercising what I think is their rightful power to structure.
Right. So even where I think this is an area where I find I thought that might be your position, and I saw the Cicilline bill coming out that way, and so I had this on my list of things this morning. I just saw that.
Right.
And so I mean, part of the new learning. I mean, there's this whole. I mean, in with the common ownership and the labor stuff and all of that other things. I mean, there's a whole buckets and buckets and buckets of economic literature and data on pernicious economic effects associated for all the reasons you don't like monopoly normally, right? But you've got, exercise of state power and largely immune from antitrust supervision unless you've got, the state has handed off, delegated the authority to a market participant, right? And that feels to me, like this is like North Carolina dental in those cases, that feels to me like an area where you and I should agree that that's bad. And I know that we don't. And so I want to hear the why. So the cases where the FTC can bring are the cases where the state has said, I'm not going to govern. I'm going to hand this to an industry participant who gets to be the monopolist and exclude competition. He gets to exclude the nurse practitioners or, Walmart from having a nurse practitioner in its store or the dental hygienist from cleaning teeth. This feels like it's pro-competition to not allow that. It's against the monopolist. It's for the small business entrant who's trying to, enter and be entrepreneurial. For all the reasons this sort of has been a bipartisan antitrust play, it feels like it should be, at least in that sliver of cases where the state's delegated its authority.
It's part of this is a question of maybe I'm going to get the term wrong, but maybe it's administrative law. Like, what's the legitimate institution to make the change? So I look at something like Seattle and what they did with ride sharing in 2016, 17, where they said, we would like to allow effectively a minimum wage for Uber and Lyft drivers. And I believe Uber sued or the Chamber of Commerce sued Seattle, saying this is an anti-competitive, this law creates some sort of anti-competitive dynamic here. And the FTC, and it was Maureen Olhausen as well as Terrell McSweeney, both signed on to an amicus brief saying, yes, we agree with this. And you've seen this in New York, where New York tried to impose a cap on livery drivers. They didn't want too many people coming in Lyft and effectively Lyft and Uber. And when I look at the attempt to get rid of occupational licensing, the argument is often, oh, well, look at how awesome Lyft and Uber are, and these rules kind of limit the consumer benefits. And I just don't. I mean, I think that if a city wants to invite Uber and Lyft in and give them a regulatory framework that lets them do whatever they want, that's that community's right to do that. But I don't know why the FTC or DOJ would have a role in telling a city how to structure its transportation market or, structure. I mean, there's got to be some sort of minimum floor on how people are treated. But why, New York or Seattle, they have specific, unique transportation needs. They have, they have a cab market, which is, it's quasi-public institution. So why would we want, and I also just don't generally think of Lyft and Uber as having business models which can be predatory. So there's probably but I just don't see why it's anything but effectively undermining the rights of working people to come in and say, we don't like occupational licensing. And granted, there are a bunch of places where, the local whoever puts up a barrier to entry, with their influence in city hall or state government. But, if I don't see why, like AT&T does that on a whole bunch of things, but we don't say, oh, that's a big process fail. We say the state, our democratic bodies made a bad decision. They should reverse that bad decision and make a good decision. So that's kind of where I come at it. I just think the attack on occupational licensing isn't really an attack on bad rules. I think it's an attack on democratic bodies being able to write rules, period.
It's interesting. So I'll say, from the antitrust perspective, in the antitrust sort of camp of folks who write about state action, I am very much a limit the state action defense to places where the state if the state has passed rules that don't have spillover effects across state lines, you let them do whatever the heck they want. Is sort of what I've written to the DOJ and FTC, including when they were getting involved in some of these disputes. I think there should be a way for a state or local government to write rules it wants to write. The antitrust limit that is imposed is when there are interstate spillovers. And now the way that the courts read the Commerce Clause means that's not really a limit, right? But the other one is that largely the cases that the agencies bring, not in amicus briefs, but in the cases they actually bring, are where the state has said the way that we are going to govern is by putting a private company in charge of the board, right? That to me feels like, and this isn't little corners of the economy or Uber or Lyft. It's 60% of the professions, right? And I think the pushback that I've heard that I take seriously is, at least in part, is, hey, when you start competition agencies, when you start taking labor stuff seriously, maybe we can talk about this. But until then, no. And I get that as a political matter, but it strikes me as a tension in some of the sort of anti-monopoly movement that monopoly created by government is off limits or closer to off limits. Is that unfair?
I mean, unions, a union is that's market power of a group of workers coming together and saying, we want higher wages. And I mean, that generally speaking, I anchor my view of monopoly in labor rights. I think that the people that do the work, this is a traditional American conception of not just antitrust, not just monopoly, but the American order itself. I mean, Benjamin Franklin said, America is a land of labor, right? The labor theory of value, I mean, which is not accepted in economics now, but that's foundational to, the 19th century American conception of what the nation was. So everybody used to talk about the fruits of their labor, right? You get the person who does the work should secure the fruits of his or her labor, although it was more gendered than that. And that's generally the way that I think about the question of monopoly. It's also the way I think about patents and copyrights and trade secrets and bankruptcy. And it's just, you want to secure the fruits of labor to the person, whether it's an engineer or a business person or a worker or whatever. And I'm not opposed to market power. I'm not for competition or against competition. These are, in many ways, they're sort of neutral descriptive terms. I think we should anchor our political economy by securing to the producer the fruits of his or her labor. And
you asked me a really good question about what I would do about income inequality or other problems in the economy. So I'm gonna try to turn that on you. So and then I promise it's the last one. I'm having a lot of fun. So what do you say to the hair braider in Louisiana or the florist who wants to open a business and the state has been lobbied by incumbents in those industries to say, let's create a requirement that is insurmountable to a potential entrant so that they cannot secure the fruits of their labor because they have been lobbied by corporate power in those industries. And like cheerleading, this is sort of everywhere. And one easy thing to do with corporate power is go lobby somebody to keep the corporate power permanent. who delegates that authority to the incumbent, who secures their monopoly for, perpetuity, or at least for as long as they can lobby the state government. That feels to me, I feel like your answer is the political process, and that's it. They can go also lobby the state government and try to persuade them otherwise.
Well, I think that you're basically just, part of what we're saying is anybody that doesn't like a political decision or political result in a society. Now, I haven't looked into the hair braider example, so I can't speak to that specifically. But, what do you say to somebody that doesn't have healthcare? What do you say to somebody, then they get cancer? What do you say to somebody who's, encounters some social problem and our society doesn't deal with it? I mean, it starts with, I'm sorry, that sucks, that you're not able to get blah or do whatever, blah, and then you present, if you want to sort of address it, then you're presenting a kind of solution to ameliorate what I think everybody would concede is an unfair situation. I'm not sure, again, I'm not speaking to the hair braider situation, but I think we can just look, and generically, there are a lot of unfair situations. And so first you say, okay, is this a situation where the law is the best vehicle to deal with this, or is this one of those shit happens things in life, right? And that if it is illegal, if it is something where there's some misgovernment going on, as opposed to something happened that was just unlucky, then you present a kind of a path to addressing it. And the path in this case could be, well, I mean, we need to have the FTC or, federal competition authorities focused on every state or city in the country and whether they're handling, professions appropriately. And it's a real procedural question. And, who knows what goes on there, but maybe we'll get to actually address the thing that you think is unfair. Or, you present a path and you say, well, some things are handled at a local level that affect the local community. Go, lobby your local official, ask, run for office or whatever you want to do and make that change locally. And I think generally speaking, if it often, it's not, certain things to me are values that I think are incredibly important. Civil rights would be one of them. I mean, there's some baseline things that I don't think you should be able to do to other people in this country. But in the case of these kind of political economy choices, I don't think you should write a blanket rule that says that states and cities can't, create safety requirements and licensing requirements for a whole bunch of different professions. And I think that's what you risk when you just sort of make it procedural as opposed to going through the state and city. And I'll say another thing, which is I think, states and cities, one of the big sort of secret projects of the Reagan, what Reagan was doing, and I think what has continued, I mean, the 96 Telecom Act was stripped power from cities to regulate their telephone networks. I think there's been a real destruction of local and state governments. They have a lot less power. We've seen a lot more preemption. And I think generally speaking, they do a better job of regulating their political economies than the federal government. I mean, it's a relative statement because oftentimes they can do bad things, but I'm saying what you want is you want the people that live, in the area to be making the rules for that area, if possible. And, it's not always the case. There are certain things that you don't want, where you don't want that to happen, where, civil rights is a sort of the main, the big area there on the left. But I think that what we have seen is the degradation of local power, and that's been a real problem. And I think it's wiped out a lot of communities in this country.
Well, we've gone way over what I said we would do, and I'm sorry for that.
Well, this was really fun, and I enjoyed it a lot. So thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you get the last word. If there's anything, I don't know, that you want to close on, but let me close by saying I really appreciate you coming on, and this has been more fun than a couple of years of Twitter with you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you inviting me on, and I appreciate your work. And I thought your national affairs piece was really interesting. And we disagree, but I enjoy your work. And I will, and it's been nice to have a fun conversation with you here. So, but I'm still gonna I feel like we've got to use Twitter for what Twitter is good for and give the people what they want on that medium. But yeah.
Invectives on Twitter tomorrow. I'll see you there.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Matt.